What's going on, guys? This is Pete here with MixBetterNow.com. I'm here with my friend Warren Huart of ProduceLikeAPro.com. Really excited. For those of you who don't know, Warren is a man of many talents. Lately, he has been wildly successful with his website, Produce Like a Pro, his YouTube channel, Produce Like a Pro. But he literally does everything from producing to playing music to mixing for bands like Aerosmith, Ace Frehley, The Fray, Augustana, one of my favorites. So I'm very happy to introduce my friend Warren Huart here. How you doing, Warren?
I'm marvelous. How the devil are you?
Yeah, I'm doing great, doing great. So we were just kind of having a little chat before we hopped on here, and we were kind of talking about a little bit of everything. So we're like, we got to pump the brakes and we got to save this for the good stuff. So I'm gonna lead this off with probably the generic lead-in question. But tell me a little bit about yourself as a kid growing up in England, and how the heck did you make it to LA working with some of my favorite bands for sure.
Yowza. Yeah, I think about that a lot. I was actually born in my parents' house.
Really?
So it's, in a little tiny house in a village called Crookham Village. Yeah, when I think about how crazy that is. Now that I have kids, I'm thinking to myself, there's no way I would have let my kids be born at home. But I think in England, I don't know. It was only my son who was born. My brother, sorry, who was born in the late 70s, who's younger than me. That I was born earlier than that. Who was finally born in hospital because my mother was in the 30s. But isn't that crazy? I'd never let anybody never do that anymore. But anyway, so I was born in this little village,
Yep.
and it was really close to a town called Fleet. If anybody who's watching. The butt of the joke with Fleet is it was this little town, and it had, a motorway, our version of a freeway, and there was no exit to get to it. So you literally had to drive past the town by a few miles, get off at a different town, and then drive back. That's how kind of inconsequential the town seemed to be. It was just one of those sort of generic little English country towns and villages. So
Sure.
I think the reason why I say that is because I often wonder at it, because, guys like us that, work in the music industry, we have to remember that we have, most people I meet have very humble roots. There's definitely a lot of kids that, dads or whatever are in the music industry, and they sort of grandfathered them in. I know there's some of those, but most of us, just picked up album covers and looked on the back and read all these things and researched it. In my case, pre-internet, like 95 revolution,
Sure.
and was just scouring magazines and cycling down to the nearest record stores and looking at records and reading all the liner notes and trying to figure out who the musicians were and the producers and the engineers. And, it's great to sort of like look back and to talk to other people that have come from little tiny towns and, have built careers. But I like talking about that, and I'm glad you asked that question, because it's like that's the great thing about YouTube, is it's this great leveler. It's allowing everybody to compete with each other and to show their talents to everybody. There's so many artists,
Sure.
of different genres, whether it be Justin Bieber or whatever it might be, that 5 Seconds of Summer, these like kid bands that you wouldn't even know about if it wasn't for YouTube.
Yeah, totally, man. Yeah, it's it really is an amazing thing. It's like sometimes I feel like YouTube and the internet is awful, and then other times you got to look at it and you just have to sort of just say how great it is, and certain things just aren't possible without it. I certainly wouldn't be here talking to you right now if YouTube or the internet wasn't around, and that's kind of the beautiful thing about it. So where you kind of grew up, were you like in a suburb of one of the bigger cities? Is that how you kind of got into playing in bands and stuff, or?
No, there's a couple of things about where I grew up. No, definitely. You could get on a train, and then you could get into London pretty quickly. On a fast train, you could be there in like 30 minutes. But England's a very different country to America. I'm not sure where you grew up, but probably driving an hour to the nearest city to go out at night wasn't a big deal for you.
Right.
In England, that's like the other side of the world.
Right, sure.
You don't even travel 20 minutes. It's like that's like the other side of the town. Like, wow, no. When somebody says to you it's just down the road, they literally mean it's just down the road. I mean, get out of your house, walk for 2 minutes, and then go to the pub.
Yep.
So that's where I grew up, in that very traditional kind of. There was a pub called the Fox and Hounds, which was a couple of minutes walk from my house. And that pub, the Fox and Hounds, had a back room, and every Tuesday night they had a thing called the Fleet Folk Club.
Okay.
And that might sound like, sometimes it was like, oh, and, very kind of traditional folk. But then other times they had guys like Martin Simpson come along, who's an amazing acoustic guitar player and singer. And then they'd have American touring artists come in. And it was just incredible. So as a little kid, I could go to the back room of the pub and sit there with my dad and watch like amazing musicians perform. And so it's interesting. I think about this all the time because people ask me questions and say, oh, in my town, there's no music. And I think there is. It's just hard to find it necessarily, but there is always something going on. You can always, when I was a kid at school, when I didn't start learning to play the guitar till I was 15, which is quite late. But as soon as I started learning to play guitar, out of the woodwork, you start meeting all these guys. Oh, yeah. Oh, I didn't know you play guitar. I play guitar. And you go around to somebody's house and they know like everything by AC/DC. And you're like, how do you play that? And then you're swapping riffs. And it's
the brotherhood.
Yeah, exactly. Yes, very much so.
You're not, per chance, the Fox and the Hound. I actually have family and friends who live in Surrey. That's not in Surrey, is it? Because I know there's probably multiple pubs.
There's multiple ones. It's in Hampshire. But Hampshire, okay. where I lived in Hampshire was the northeast of Hampshire. It was about 7 or 8 miles from the border of Surrey, so it's quite close.
Interesting. Okay, right on, man. That's so cool. So fast forward a little bit. So of course you're kind of absorbing all of this local culture and a lot of the local folk music and some of these touring acts that come through. I have a similar sort of place where I live right now. I born and raised in New Jersey. I'm currently living in New Jersey, but for a while I was down in Florida. I went to college down in Florida, and I lived down there for a while. But there's coincidentally in Orlando, there's a really good music scene, and not a lot. A lot of people think Orlando, they think Creed and the Backstreet Boys and all this stuff. But there's a lot of great talent down there. Anyway, I live very close to an area in New Jersey called the Pine Barrens, and there's this little sort of music hall over here called I'm going to botch the name now. It's called Albert Hall, I think. And we get all these incredible bluegrass players coming out from the Pine Barrens who are all like these like super rednecky dudes, but they are just absolutely killing it, on a small musical level, playing a lot of dreadnoughts and mandolins and stuff like that. So it's really fun to just go over there on certain nights, and because otherwise I got to drive about 30 minutes to Asbury Park, where you've got the Stone Pony and you've got all that kind of stuff where you can catch a show. So anyway, so like I said, fast forward a little bit, and so I know you were playing in bands and stuff as you kind of got a little bit older. So how'd you make it to LA, and really how'd you sort of break into the audio world? I know most people, the natural transition is like you play music and all you want to do is to be able to record your own band and your own music. So kind of give me a little. Yeah,
that's my journey. That's what was interesting is, my experience of starting off as a musician and then eventually becoming a producer was completely different to the way. How can I explain it? Let's explain it much better. Basically, the way that I became a producer is the way everybody becomes a producer now. But back in my age group, 25 years ago, that isn't how it happened. The only way to become a credible producer, engineer, or whatever in those days was, number one, to go and intern and assist at a studio and build a massive credit list as an intern, as an assistant, then eventually an engineer, then a producer and a mixer, etc. That was 90% of the producers, or they were big musicians, famous musicians that decided to become producers. When you looked at the back of album credits when we were kids, it was always studio guys. They always started off as house engineers in London, as in Trident or Olympic or Abbey Road, and then they eventually became producers. And that, I would say, is most of the big names that I like. Half the guys I know, I'm friends with Shelley Yakkus and Jack Douglas. All those guys were studio rats. Right. They became producers. Me, I did it the way that everybody does now, which is why I identify so much with YouTube and so much with what we do, because I was just a kid in a band who had, first of all, 2 cassette players. So what I would do is I'd record guitar onto my little crappy Philips cassette player that my dad gave me, an old one. And then I'd take the cassette player out, put it in the stereo, play that back, and do a lead line over the top.
Yeah.
and then take that tape out and put that back in there and swap it over, and eventually you got like 4 or 5 guitar parts with a lot of hiss in the background. You know, it's like shh. But you know, I wanted to be Brian May, so I was trying to build harmony parts up at like 15 years old, very badly, I might add. But so my journey is like my journey to get where I am is completely mirrored by what is really happening now. That's why I identify so much with the people that watch our channels and watch everybody's channels and are trying to learn, because I'm just like, this is great. I wish I had this when I was learning how to do stuff, because I've never assisted in a studio. I've had studios where I've assisted somebody else, you know, but I had to get to that point of having a studio by doing it all myself. And so I love this medium. I love YouTube for that ability, and I love all of social media to be able to impart that information back. Yeah. And because, you know, I didn't have any relatives in the music industry. I didn't have any of the sort of advantages that quite a few people have. So I'm able to sort of, you know, say it from literally, express literally the truth, which is like taking artists, I would develop them, I would produce them, you know, develop them, then take them to a label and get them signed. And then that eventually got me work, you know, from labels.
So you actually never did a proper like assistantship or an internship? You just sort of were working on your own, and then that's how you kind of started working with all these amazing artists? Wow.
Yeah, and I did it at a time when it was a lot more difficult, and it was a lot. It was very, nobody could take you seriously. Nobody took you seriously at all for doing this kind of stuff. Yeah. And it's difficult, you know. I've seen, and that's why one of the reasons why I started the channel, because not just because I could identify with the journey that people are forced to take now, where there isn't these incredible studio system that there used to be. So you're sort of forced into doing it yourself anyway. Not only to do that, but also to sort of like crack down some boundaries, because I feel like there was kind of a gap in the YouTube world, because there was definitely a lot of like elitist, like, you know, look at me, I'm really successful, and kind of conversation. And then there was a lot of incredible sort of like beginner stuff and getting people started. And all I wanted to do was just sit firmly in the middle and just talk to both sets of people, because I have built a career in the music industry and I have made a bunch of, you know, relatively successful albums. I'm friends with a lot of my peers. Right. But I identify most with guys like you and I that kind of just have to hustle our asses off to make money.
Sure.
You know, I've never, ever been in that fortunate position where I was the go-to guy for an A&R guy that was just getting record after record after record to mix. You know, most of the guys that we know from the period of the sort of 90s that were successful in early 2000s, you know, they weren't competing against anybody.
Right,
they weren't. It was a closed shop. There wasn't like young guys like you coming up going, oh yeah, I've worked on this new band. If you worked on a new band and you brought it into a label, they go, great. And then they just take it from you. You know, if you were lucky, you might have a contract with the artist and get paid a couple of grand for all your work. Most of the time you didn't. It was taken from you. It was given to another famous producer who copied your production. A famous guy mixed it. It came out. And I can tell you of hundreds of albums that were done like that. And it was a very lucrative business in the 90s and early 2000s. And probably the reason why every record from like 95 to 2004 sounded exactly the same. Yeah. You know what I mean? And we talk about it all the time. Kids talked about it at the time. They were embracing Napster and MP3. You know, they were going, why do I want to buy a record when there's 10 songs on the album, there's one single, and then 9 songs which sound exactly the same? But they had to buy the album. Sure. I mean, you remember those days. Sure. It was just like, and those were like factory productions, and you know, all of the love and that record making that we loved from the 60s and the 70s and through the 80s, all of that art, all of that, every song having its own, you know, feel. Like you put on a rock record from the 70s or the 80s, it doesn't sound like one song. Right. Put on a mid-90s emo, mid to late 90s emo rock, early 2000s, it sounds like the same frickin' production on every single song. You could tell they went in there, they put some mics up on the drums, tracked 10 songs in a row, edited it tight, played bass, 10 songs, edited it tight, played guitars, same like Bogner, whatever it was. No disrespect to Bogner, but whatever heavy rock amp it was. Yeah. And then just edited that tight, sang over it, tuned it, mixed it, put it out. And maybe there was, it was.
And you're totally right. You know, I feel like during that era, there was so many gatekeepers, you know, to the record industry. No, I was watching an interview you did with Dave Pensato, and you said a brilliant thing that I loved, and I totally agree with. And you were talking about drummers, and you said, kind of alluding to that time period, you know, that they were all good drummers, but you couldn't tell one drummer from another, from another, from another. And if you put up Ringo and Charlie Watts, and you put up guys like, you know, Bonham and Moon, and all of these heroes of mine, for sure, because my favorite music is from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. And you were also talking about a similar thing with the feel and how everything today is so gridded, and it sort of sucks the soul and a lot of the life and character out of a lot of the records. You know, and so do you feel like the situation that we're in now today, where I think another thing you said was the playing field is now leveled because everybody has access to all this stuff. So are you hearing bands come along now that are starting to get some more identity back, or do you feel like it's still sort of we're in this we're hearing a lot of similar sounding records? Because for me, I struggle with modern day music sometimes. It's like some stuff I'm like I either love or I'm just kind of like it's not for me.
No, I think that's an important thing. I think that but I believe strongly there's a little bit more to it than probably I explained in that original interview with Dave, because it's not just about the gridded drumming. Sometimes, well, there's two things. If you're working with a phenomenal musician, like a Victor Andrizzo or a Matt Chamberlain or one of those kind of session players, Vinnie Colaiuta, you know, Blair Sinter, these are all guys I work with that are phenomenal. And when they push and pull time, it seems like it's for a reason. If they come in on the one a little ahead or a little behind, it's going to add some urgency or weight. If something's late, it just feels like somebody's kicked you in the stomach, you know, da 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 da, you know, and it's got that like weight, you know, like an extra nanosecond late. It just feels like, wow, that downbeat's so much heavier because you're like, you know, or if it's the other way around, they kind of push the downbeat, it adds some urgency to it and it pushes you back. So, but those are great musicians do that stuff. Now, I think that editing is an amazing tool because some of the young bands you'll work with, not all, but some of the young bands up and coming don't necessarily have those chops yet. They're still working. So the ability to edit in the right hands with the right skill set is an amazing thing.
Sure.
And I think it's really important because we've always edited, even on tape. You know, when they did disco in the 70s and stuff like that, they would add leader tape. They would measure each of the kicks to try and lay it back and make sure it was in exactly the same place. And it would take a day to edit a drum track.
Wow.
But they did it really, you know, I know a lot of those guys from the 70s, you know, and we talk about how they made records and they did insanely crazy things to make things. You know, Dave Jordan was doing it with Alice in Chains, with the drummer sitting there editing stuff, but it was all on tape on the first record.
Okay.
Before they started getting into DAW, so it's always been something you did. Whether it be the Beatles, you know, slowing down the tape to half speed so they can play the part properly, you know, punching in, fixing, and then speeding it back up by playing it an octave lower. Tubular Bells by Mike Oldfield, one of the most cutting-edge albums ever, recorded on his own in his studio at home, would do all kinds of tricks, you know, whether it be cutting tape, slowing tape down. I mean, you can read it in interviews. We've always done things to get the best results. What goes horribly awry is when you rely on the technique and you're not, you know what I mean? I think that we can be critical with those kind of records that are unfortunately easy to dismiss now. Those kind of, a lot of those rock records from that period that we can dismiss now and they just sound so samey, is that there was just a systematic way of recording, that everything was just like, you know, load in the drums, grid it, put in this, grid it, you know, and maybe for a period, and I get it, it may have sounded fresh that everything was so like tiny. But I remember in the late 90s, the great Andy Wallace, who was mixing quite a few of these records, had a very, very pointed interview, which if you sort of read between the lines, he was talking about the records he was getting to mix by these bigger producers. And he's like, everything is sounding smaller. He said, everything sounds smaller because when you get everything perfectly on the one and everything's like, it goes from going gra, gra, gra to tick, 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 tick. You know, like every transient is like lined up over the top of everything. And suddenly this big massive guitar rake, bass kind of hitting slightly after the kick sitting here. All of that big fat one now becomes like this tiny everything lining up on top of each other. And
Right.
I remember reading that going, Andy's subtly telling you producers, give him stuff that has some feel and has some girth to it.
Yeah.
But to answer the second part of your question, I think that there are bands. One of the only things that I think one of the difficult things I think is that bands are very, very aware, too aware of being pop. They're a little afraid to write songs that translate to radio. And it seems that you've either got Imagine Dragons, which is like pure pop music, could be Bruno Mars writing the songs, but done in a more, edgy, synth-based hip hop meets rock. And they're a great band, don't get me wrong. Or you've got really cool indie bands, of which there's a million different cool indie bands, but they're afraid to write something that could get on the charts. I think we're in a good time, but I think we're in this sort of like development stage where everybody's trying to figure it out and everybody's trying to find their identity.
Sure.
You know,
Sure.
but I know what you're saying. I love bands from earlier periods, but I do love modern artists as well. It's just like, how do you? It's tough for modern artists.
Yeah, I jotted some down just because some bands that I currently am really enjoying, and I don't know how you feel about them, but bands like Rival Sons, Dawes, I'm a massive Ryan Adams fan. Blake Mills, The Shelters. I don't know if you've heard of them. They're a great band from L.A. Tedeschi Trucks Band. These are some bands nowadays they have incredible musicianship. They're not afraid to sort of have their own sound. They're not afraid to write a catchy song, but they're kind of doing the whole thing. Two bands that you've actually worked with, who I'm massive fans of, Augustana and The Fray. Looking back, when you worked with them, was there a certain like formula or a certain way that you sort of went about producing them, where it was like, okay, here's bands with incredible songs, because that's sort of like that's the common denominator for me with anyone is songs. They've got great songs. So how do you approach records like that to sort of not get too poppy and not too cliched, but at the same time, like, not keep them too indie and like, well, I don't want to write amazing hooks. Like, how do you kind of tiptoe that tightrope when you're producing, personally?
Well, they have it's interesting because I did the second Augustana record and then the Frey's second album 1 week apart.
Wow.
So we did, and I had done 2 records in a row. Mike Flynn and I, who's now like the head of A&R for Capitol, we did a band called Vedera, who are incredible band. We did that album in Indiana, and then we flew back home and started Augustana's record immediately afterwards. And we had done pre-production with Augustana for, I don't know, it was over 3 months. Not at once, but over 3 months. We probably did 6 weeks of it. It was a lot of pre-production. And we'd sit down with Dan and just strip the songs down, change keys, change tempos. It was a lot of work. Just Mike, I, and Dan in a room, in this back room with a little Neve and everything. It was a lot of fun, but we stripped the songs down, demoed the songs, and really, really worked them hard. And then we brought in Jared and South, the drummer, the original bass player and drummer in those days, brought them in and did like probably 10 days, 2 weeks in a rehearsal room, like going through all of the songs. So we worked that super, super hard before even the songs, the arrangements, the keys, the tempos, everything was set in stone before we even had the band come in. Then we had the rest of the band come in and we went through and just like worked on all the parts. And I actually hired Brian McLeod, who's a good friend of mine, who was the drummer with Sheryl Crow on Tuesday Night Music Club. Hired him, and he came in and sat with South, and they brainstormed and tried out different ideas. And I thought that was a really, sometimes you just have to be smart about it. And with South, I mean, the drum parts were very simple on that album, but I felt like a drummer as amazing as Brian was able to communicate with South, and they were able to like kind of find parts that worked, and it was a really, really great experience. And I really feel like that album was made in pre-production.
Okay.
And my old studio they used to have in Hollywood, I learned from watching Rick Rubin work. There's a lot of, you know, stuff talked about Rick Rubin, but I've seen when he works at his finest, and I'll tell you how he works at his finest. We would have the Chili Peppers came in for, I want to say, 6 months and did pre-production for 6 months for Californication.
Wow.
So when John Frusciante got back into the band, they just went in there and worked their asses off. And so I've seen Rick work the way that when he's firing on all cylinders, this is how he works. He basically, the band come in for like 6 months, 5 days a week, 6 hours a day, you know, like 6 hours, which is long for a pre-production session, trust me.
For sure.
So 6 hours a day, 5 days a week for like 6 months. And there was a huge whiteboard in there, massive whiteboard. And it had like 20, 30, 40 ideas down. And they had all the sort of generic things that bands do, like Disco One, you know, Duran Duran. They had like reference points. I remember one song called Duran Duran. I can't remember what that turned into. But they had these like working titles. Wow. And then like Anthony was set up in front of the band. The three-piece was like sitting in front of him. And he would set up there and he had, you know, he had a music stand, lyric book, you know, a stool, just, you know, standing kind of stool where he could stand up and they just work their asses off. And I would sit there recording DAT tapes for hours, DAT tape after DAT tape after DAT tape of just them like trying ideas. And they would jam on a groove for sometimes like 45 minutes or an hour till they got that like incredible groove that they have. Yeah. Their records aren't, you know, their records have feel because they're amazing players and they work off each other. Yeah. And it was a lot of fun, especially as a guitar player, because John would bring in everything. He'd have like a Gretsch White Falcon to a Telecaster to a Dan Electro to whatever, all these crazy guitars. He also had like one of the first Korg guitar synths, and they would just try schnizzle out, pedals, whatever, and jam and jam and jam. And you know, and Anthony would rap and try ideas and sing ideas and melodies, and they just record. But it was very organized. And Rick would come in and he'd sit down for an hour or two every day, or leave them for 2 days and then come in for a few hours on another day and sit down and listen to all of the ideas and then talk to them, give them ideas to work on, then go away for a day or two, come back, go through it. And that's why that record was the big comeback record. After the Dave Navarro record, that record was like huge. Sure. And it put them back on the map. You know, I think it was early 2000 or something like that. And it was just like, it was like a boom, the Chili Peppers are back in a big way. So I remember that experience thinking, you know, that's why those records that Rick makes, when he makes records that are like phenomenal like that, that's why they do so well, because he does so much pre-production. And there's that criticism leveled at Rick where he's like, well, you know, when he's producing, it's like, you know, he doesn't do that much, or he's not in the studio that often. You know why? Because he's done 6 months of pre-production. All he really needs to do is hire an incredible engineer not to screw it up.
Yep.
Because all the work has been done before. Yeah. So for me, I felt like the Augustana, it's a long answer to your question, I'm sorry. No but the reason why I think the Augustana record was really successful for us, and the same with the Vedera record, which unfortunately got delayed by the label, which is very unfortunate, by 2 years. It did eventually come out, but 2 years later, it should have come out at that time, but whatever, when that music was bigger. But although those records were made in pre-production, sitting down with the artist, going through the songs, changing keys, changing tempos, reworking all of the songs. Some cases it was rewriting. Some cases it was like with Vedera, I wrote on those songs. And then sometimes it was just like rearranging, giving the artist an idea, having them go home, work on some parts, come back in with a fresh chorus idea, you know, say what you like, what you don't like, giving them the opportunity to express themselves. But those records were made in pre-production. Right. And so we did those 2 records back to back, and then I took a week off and went on vacation with my newly born son and my wife. And I mean, we took a week away, and I think we'd done like 3 to 4 months solid. Took a week off and then went back and worked with the Fray for 9 months on that second album. Wow! Because with the Fray, the first album had sold 4 million copies and had been so successful that we, which at the time was the beginning of an anomaly. That was like having an album that was successful. It was right at the time when record sales were dipping quite dramatically. So, you know, they were like, whoa, you know, you're doing so well in comparison. So with the second album, we came back and we went straight into the studio, and it was more of a process of pre-production / recording. It was, there was ideas that were relatively fleshed. There was ideas that were still being worked on, but they were in a much more luxurious place than, say, Vedera or Augustana were, where they could spend time and money in a studio developing ideas, just like the Beatles would do or whatever, where they would take song ideas and then,
Yeah.
be in Abbey Road working on them. They were in a very, um, it's a very, very luxurious place to be, and probably not really available to most people anymore. But they deserved it. They earned it. They
Sure.
had had
Sure.
such a successful record, and they toured solidly for 2 years. So, but I will say, because of what you were alluding to as well about those bands was like how much they bring to it. Now with Augustana, I feel like there was a lot of reworking,
Okay.
and it was definitely like pulling the songs apart. I feel like with the Fray, it's interesting because the Fray at the time were always criticized by critics and considered to be like overthought and focus groups and stuff. And I actually felt that was the exact opposite of the reality.
Wow.
I
Okay.
feel like Isaac was what he wrote was what he wrote, and to be really really blunt, he came into that with very little. Sorry, Isaac, I'm just going to throw you under the bus. Isaac didn't grow up listening to any commercial music whatsoever.
Really?
He's a man of beliefs and convictions. He really is a Christian. He doesn't wear it. He doesn't use it inappropriately. He really is the real deal. He's a really good person. I don't know if I've ever talked about this in an interview, but I'll tell you, when we were in Sausalito, this is just a sideline. I think it's when we were in Sausalito, we would do, when we weren't working till 3 a.m, when we had an early enough night, we'd all meet up and have breakfast, at a beautiful breakfast joint, like very close to the studio. So we'd all meet up, the band, the crew, everybody involved, because they had their full crew there, had all the production team there. We'd meet up and we'd have breakfast, and it was wonderful. And every morning we'd have breakfast. Isaac would turn up with a different kid, and wouldn't have breakfast with us for the full time, like turn up like halfway through and introduce us to this kid, and be like, hey, this is my friend John. And we'd say, hey John, nice to meet you. Then a couple of days later, here's my friend Pete, here's my friend James. And it was really cool. But obviously after a few weeks, we're there for 3 months, I'm thinking to myself, dang, this guy's got a lot of friends, and he does have a lot of friends, and he's really active, really active in his community. Anyway, it turns out this was like a Big Brother program, and these were kids that he was. So here he is. He sold 4 million records. He's a huge rock star with no ego whatsoever, and he's still doing the same stuff that he did before he was successful.
Amazing.
And
That's great.
yeah, so he's the real deal.
Yeah.
The real deal. So it was always interesting because I'd read these critic stuff, and they'd always make it seem like it was totally contrived. It's not. I mean, the thing about the Fray, and I think particularly on those first and second records, is it was very just. There was no overthinking. It was just, that's who we are.
Yeah.
And it was. I'm not saying they were easy records to make as a result, but I think that second record, it definitely took a lot of time because they'd been on the road for 2 years, so they hadn't fully written. They were still finishing writing material in the studio. But I think the reason why that record was, almost as equally successful, considering it was 2 to 3 years later and the record sales had dropped. But I think the reason why it was and that You Found Me single was almost as big as How to Save a Life. It was a huge song. Never Say Never was huge.
Right.
I think the reason for that is because, and I strongly believe this, is because there's an honesty in it. I think that I really strongly believe when it comes to music and you've got a message like that, if it comes from a really honest place like Isaac has, people will identify with it.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
When he's singing How to Save a Life and he's talking about being a camp counselor and helping kids and stuff like that, that's what that song is about. That's a real experience.
Wow.
When he sings You Found Me about his fame and his struggles with like, wow, what are you doing, God? You're giving me all of this stuff, oh, what's all this fame and adulation? I'm just another guy. And he writes a song about it. People identify with it because, whatever your faith, whatever your belief system, we all have these sort of existential sort of things that we go through. We question everything. You work really, really hard to get something, and then somebody, screws you over or something like that, and you're just like, really? I've done all
Right.
this work and this guy's ripping me off or whatever it might be. You know, you have these existential. This makes you question so many things. And when Isaac wrote these songs that did become so successful, it's because they were from an honest place, and there wasn't any rewriting of his lyrics. There wasn't. So it was interesting because the critics were calling his band like that when really he was so honest about it.
Yeah. Right.
And then we had other bands that we were sitting in there ripping the songs apart. So I think it's, you know, having having been involved in records that have lots of either critical acclaim or the opposite, and then reading critics telling you how it is, how it was made. It's quite funny. You're like,
Yeah.
oh yeah, sure,
Yeah.
yeah, that's
Yeah.
exactly how it's made.
Yep. Yeah. Critics are they're always right. It's what what's so amazing about hearing all that is what it sounds like to me, which translates probably to our audiences and a lot of up and coming, young people playing music or, aspiring audio engineers or, or even if they're guys who are, 50, 60 years old who are rediscovering, I used to do this when I was a kid and now I can buy an interface and a microphone. It sounds
Yep,
to me like the common denominator here is graft and hard work. Is,
yep.
it's talent. It's I guess the age old debate of talent versus hard work. What would you rather have? The amazing work ethic or just to be talented? And the more I hear about these stories or people who know about these super successful bands or artists or records or all of these things in our industry and what we do, is that hard work seems to trump everything else. I mean, of course you have to be talented, but I think it's those people who really put in that, the 6 months of pre-pro and all that stuff who really, it really comes out. So, I guess the question then is how do we convey that to, how do you teach hard work to somebody? Especially people who are watching you on Produce Like a Pro and who are sort of, learning and trying to absorb every little drop that you put out. And the same thing for me or someone else who is doing sort of what we do. That's a tough thing to teach, right? I mean, you know,
It is. I think that wow, it's such a huge question.
right.
I think wow, it's such a massive question.
I know it's
So many,
trippy.
so many. Well, I mean, because it's an hour long answer. The
Yeah, yeah.
so many artists that we admire and are massively flawed human beings
Okay.
with huge emotional issues and mental instability and stuff. I mean, I'm not going to start naming them, but they're all obvious. I mean, hence drug overdoses and suicides and stuff like that.
Sure.
So there's different things. Like I have a very good friend of mine, a drummer who's a very well-known drummer. I'm not going to say his name, who told me that when he was a kid, he had a very depressive illness, and he actually found out later in life that his father also had it, and he wished his father had told him, and that as a kid he contemplated suicide on a couple of different things as a little kid. So really terrifying that a little kid should want to do that. But when he started playing drums, he got that endorphin rush. He got that thing playing along with records, and that just, I would say healed him, but it gave him something. I have a similar story. When I started playing music and just listening to music, it took me to a different place. And I think that's a story for so many of us. So I think it comes down to, yes, I'm a little careful to be critical of millennials because that's what we all do. And I totally understand why people want to do that and want to go to that place. I believe that if you find something that you just connect with, whether it's playing guitar or bass or writing, recording, mixing, whatever it might be, if that gives you the rush, the adrenaline, the endorphins, whatever it might be, if that satisfies you, for me, it was like putting on a pair of headphones and just shutting the whole world out and just being in my music and playing and recording and being very critical on myself and pushing myself and working till 4 o'clock in the morning, like all of us that do music do, all that insane kind of stuff. If that just happens and that spark goes off, that light bulb lights up, whatever that moment is, if that happens for you, then the work is kind of incidental. I mean, I used to play guitar. I still play guitar for hours a day, but I used to play guitar from like 16 to whatever age, 6 to 8 hours a day, every single day. And I was just a sponge. You could give me an album, I'd put it on and try and figure it out, play it at half speed on a vinyl player, play it at 16, trying to figure out the parts. There was no YouTube in those days. I'd buy books. I'd sit down with another guitar player, say, how do you do that riff? It was my drug. It's what got me excited. So I think that I don't think it's a question of work or not. I think if that's not happening and that spark and that light bulb is not going off, then it's really hard to tell somebody or install a work ethic, because I think the work ethic is there when you have the love. I really do. Passion, all of those words that we want to use. When you have those things, because you can be passionate and love something and work 10 hours a day and not learn something, or you can work for 2 hours and learn something. But I feel like you need to do all of those. I think I have many months or years in my life where I span my wheels, but I feel like by spinning my wheels, created some frustration that when I did see something that was going to make me grow as an artist or grow as a producer, I went for it. I think that it's like when you become a dad, like I have young kids, when you become a dad, you find this with kids that you want to show them stuff, but they need to fail. They need to do stuff on their own to learn. And I feel like what I want to do, and I really strongly believe, is just to encourage. There's so many sites, there's so many stuff where it's just people trash talking each other and telling you don't know. You go to like forums and like it's just literally a battle of this guy sucks, he doesn't know what he's talking about. This doesn't this or this doesn't that. Yeah. And I actually like talking to those people because I want to find out what their motivating factor is. If whether it be usually like a jealousy or it's not even jealousy, that's wrong. It's a feeling like they need to connect. And I talk to a lot of those people and I end up becoming really good friends with them and really good colleagues because I realize they just want to be heard. And they've been in forums where they're so used to that negativity that it almost becomes their way of communicating with each other. Yeah. And I think that's, where I believe this should all be about helping each other. It should be about.
Perfectly put, man.
Yeah, let's just help each other. And you were asking me about, like, earlier, the thing is, that's the reason why I have the Academy, because the Academy, we do mixes every month, but we also, when I give out the files, there's a lot of my guys do production stuff on it as well, because it is produced like a pro. It's not mixed like a pro.
Sure.
And it's all about the production for me. And there's literally, 1,000 YouTube channels that just talk about mixing. And the reason, why do people talk about mixing? I say it all the time. The reason why people talk about mixing is because they can spend their lives doing technical stuff. I could go online and look at 10 different videos on how to mix a kick drum, and then within 20 minutes do my own how to mix a kick drum video. But it doesn't teach you, it teaches you sort of a plug and play, paint by numbers kind of way of doing stuff, which doesn't make you the records that you want to make. It just makes you the things that we're every human being is critical of and frustrated by. So to me, it's like, I want to encourage people to get together, create music, have a community. That's what I care about. I care about a community of people helping each other.
Yeah. And that's, that's something that I've always been really impressed, by what you do for, is it's all been positive. Ever since I started following you, I think I discovered you on YouTube maybe like 2 years ago, something like that, maybe a year and a half ago.
Yeah, I launched just over 2 years ago. Yeah,
about then. You actually were doing a studio tour with, and I forget the woman's name, but she had a very cool little project studio, and you guys were hanging out. And
Linda Taylor.
Linda Taylor. There you go. And I just thought I really loved the enthusiasm. I loved how you respond and interacted with all of your YouTube comments, and because there's, without naming names, there's a lot of YouTube channels and a lot of blogs out there where some people try and, teach audio in general, producing, recording, mixing, and some are kind of too cool for school, and they almost have this, this ego and this air about them. So, I really enjoyed that you were out there kind of in the trenches promoting positivity and just being a normal guy, like, despite.
I'm just a regular dude who grew up in a crappy little place. I mean, it was beautiful where I grew up, but like just a little place, and I just worked really, really hard. But I was driven by love of it. So I don't need a medal for saying I worked hard.
Yeah.
I worked hard because I loved doing what I was doing.
All right, guys, so Warren unfortunately has to run. He's going to go do a Q&A for the Produce Like a Pro Academy, which is fantastic. If you haven't checked that out, please go do that. ProduceLikeAPro.com. I will put all of the links and the contact information in the show notes. We're probably going to do a part 2 here because we didn't get to talk about all the good stuff we wanted to. So, but hey, Warren, I just want to say thank you so much for coming on here and having a
Thank you.
fun chat, talking about music and all that good stuff. And
thank you ever so much. I really appreciate it.
Have a great day, man, and I'm sure we will talk again soon, all right?
Yeah, fantastic. Thanks a lot, Pete. I really appreciate it.
My name is Pete.
Have a marvelous time.
Yep, that's right. Have a marvelous time. My name is Pete with MixBetterNow.com. That's been Warren with ProduceLikeAPro.com. We'll catch you guys later.
Thanks. Bye-bye.